Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special lunchtime chat. Lunchtime for us, dinner time for Ian, who's in the UK. Um, Ian, Streets for All is an organization in Los Angeles that is fighting to make the streets safe for all modes of transportation. We also passed a ballot measure last year called Measure HLA that will make the city of Los Angeles, whether it wants it or not, more multimodal and safer for all modes of transportation. So we're very interested in what you study. Let me give you a proper intro and we'll get into some questions. So I think everybody here is probably pretty familiar with your work, but for those of you that aren't, Ian is a professor of psychology and head of the School of Psychology at Swansea University. Before he was at Surrey University, and for many years before that, worked at the University of Bath. He is an environmental psychologist working across a range of areas, making use of psychological ideas like behavior change, habits, identities, and how our surroundings shape our behavior. His work on motonormativity, which is how I first got introduced to you, we found especially fascinating. It is motonormativity is the study of the shared bias that prevents us from judging motorized transportation rationally, its causes and its effects on public perceptions. The study led Ian to ask whether electric cars are really a motonormative non-solution that don't address most of today's transport problems. So Ian, welcome again. I'm gonna ask some questions, then we'll open it up to audience questions. So my first question is really basic. What is motonormativity? The example that really struck me was the cigarette example, where if someone was smoking in front of an elementary school, most people might be like, hey, don't do that. There's children present. But if someone is idling in a big SUV in front of an elementary school, no one says anything. So what is motonormativity?
Well, interestingly, I was quite excited recently to discover that this has now got a Wikipedia entry, which I think is like arriving in the world that an idea you've come up with now has its own entry on there. So Wikipedia describes motor normativity as an unconscious cognitive bias in which the assumption is made that motor car ownership and use is an unremarkable social norm. And I think that's fair enough. But I think the more interesting bit is actually a couple of things that derive from that, a couple of effects or phenomena that come from uh, this assumption that everybody drives everywhere. And the first of those is that we've argued it leads people to really struggle to imagine alternatives to the way the world is today. That people take the world that they've seen and assume it must not change and cannot change. And the other phenomenon that falls out of motor normativity, we've argued, is that it leads people to suspend the values that they would normally apply in any other situation and do a kind of special pleading for the topic of motorized driving, motorized mobility. And that's where things like um, permitting car idling whilst complaining about smoking arises in this one specific topic because it just feels unchangeable to people. It feels almost like the weather. It's just this thing that happens. There's nothing you can do about it. You just got to accommodate it. And that leads people to fail to apply the standards that they would do in other situations.
And does motonormativity exist as a result of a carefully hatched diabolical plan by automotive interests, or is there something about cars that just makes us think differently about them in particular?
Well, I wish it was a diabolical plan. And I think in some ways, one of the things that's most interesting about it is you kind of get a lot of people giving their labor for free for the interests of large industries that could probably do to pay them. Um, yeah, obviously, as with a lot of things, there are vested interests, and there are people who want to avoid change, and there are people who defend the status quo, and there are people who argue in bad faith. But I suspect that's mostly a minority. I suspect for a lot of people, it's not malicious, it's not a deliberate attempt to derail change or to stop progress or anything like that. I think it's just that people find it very hard to picture a world that is different to the one they're familiar with. And I think that's particularly the case. And this is one of the things we've really argued a lot recently in the work I did with Michael Schneider from Netherlands. it's particularly the case when everything lines up to send the same message. So I've chosen a backdrop here, which is my university campus. What you can't see just along the seafronts here, in front of these trees, is a really large dual carriageway strode, as we'd often call them these days. Um, and everybody drives everywhere here. This is a really car sick city. My neighbour drives 400 meters to work every day, and nobody thinks this is weird. And in an environment where it's socially normal and the streets are designed to make it easy and normal, and there's no limits on advertising, and where it's completely acceptable to sell finance to somebody to buy a product they can't really afford. And all of these things line up to send the message that this is normal, this is fine. Um, and we've argued that, this conjunction, or this almost perfect storm of circumstances. The streets encourage you to drive, the law encourages you to drive, the global finance system encourages you to drive, your neighbors encourage you to drive. They all push in the same direction. And it's hardly surprising in that context that people find it really hard to imagine change, because everywhere they look, they're seeing support for the status quo.
Why is it extra important to uncover this bias? I mean, all of us every day walk around constantly. We have subconscious biases about many things in life. So why is this one extra important?
That's a really good question. I think in some ways you wouldn't necessarily argue that this is more important than biases we might carry about race or gender or things like this. It just feels like society's got a bit further talking about those to some extent. But one of the reasons why I find this bias interesting and worth addressing is partly that it is so endemic. And I think a lot of other biases are not so deeply enmeshed into every facet of society, all the way down to the built environments and things like that. Everywhere you look, the micro and macro level design of our streets, the messaging, the media, they all push in this direction. And it feels like we need to be tackling this one, not to the exclusion of other biases, not to the exclusion of other unconscious prejudices that people carry, because they're obviously incredibly important as well. But this one has so far gone largely unremarked, and fundamentally is killing an awful lot of people. Globally, what is the figure? 1.2 million people a year just from collisions are being killed. Vastly more people from air pollution being killed. Vastly more again from physical inactivity linked to car dependency and streets that prohibit active travel. So this is a bias that is literally killing millions of people a year. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I find it interesting to look at this one.
During the HLA campaign that was all about safety, road safety, we often talked about how a pedestrian in Los Angeles is injured every 5 hours and killed every 2 days. And if there was a serial killer on the loose in the city that was killing someone every 2 days and injuring someone every 5 hours, there would be an all-out manhunt for that person to be brought to justice.
Yeah.
But somehow people don't like the stat, but they kind of shrug and move on with their day. It's maybe another example here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good example of what we're up against. And that it's a really good example of that suspension of the values we would apply in any other situation. One of the things that I think relates to that, and I was talking to a journalist here the other day about this, is I think it reveals something about the way that we construct the danger. So I read a book that's really stuck with me years ago about 18th century sailors. One of the things that was in this book was it was relatively common that you would end up stuck in a life raft with 8 other sailors 3 weeks from shore, and you were going to die of starvation. And it had lots of graphic descriptions about what had happened in these situations, and inevitably you'd end up drawing lots for who gets eaten. Uh, and it always sticks with me because it feels like that's how we talk about traffic danger. It's like, well, yeah, yes, someone gets killed every 2 days, but it's all kind of fair. It's all, we've all got a ticket in the lottery, and there's not much we can do about it, but it's kind of fair. And I think we do imagine it somehow like those sailors in the lifeboat going, well, yeah, one of us has got to be eaten, fair enough. As long as it's an equal chance, then we'll go along with it, which is what people used to do. And I think that's how we're viewing the traffic danger. But then that windshield blindness that arises from motor normativity means that people completely inappropriately feel that we've all got one ticket in the drawer. Whereas, of course, if you're walking or riding a bike, you've got a lot of tickets in the drawer. And the person in a massive truck has very few tickets in that lottery. But we don't see that. We act as if it's kind of all fair and balanced. And I think that's one of the facets that leads us not to address the risk as we would elsewhere, exactly as you're suggesting.
Yeah, a lot of people say shared responsibility, but when someone's in a 4-ton SUV and I'm on a
Yeah.
bicycle, that's not so equal.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference between countries in terms of the bias? For example, are transit-rich cities or countries less biased than, say, for example, the very auto-dependent United States?
We've not gone that detailed to say, this city versus that city. But the most recent piece of work we did, the one I did with Marco Brummelstruit, we did compare three countries. And you'll be pleased to hear that R2 are two of them. So we had the United Kingdom, the USA, and the Netherlands. And we thought that that was quite an important comparison because it gives us three different environments and three different cultures, but not too different. Yes, it would be very interesting to compare the USA and China or India or somewhere like that, but there's a lot of differences. We thought, we'll take three roughly comparable Western nations and see what they look like. And we measured this tendency to motor normativity, this tendency to apply different standards to driving questions than other questions. And sure enough, we found that the UK and the US were extremely similar, that really, really similar levels in the people we measured, 600 and something people from each country. And the Netherlands was substantially lower. So that suggests, that kind of backs up that story I was saying earlier about how this gets shaped by your environment. So, and potentially what we see with the Netherlands is you potentially get environments that become a virtuous circle. You build a physical world that makes active travel easy or makes non-car travel easy. That in turn makes non-car travel common, which means there's a political will to make it easier, which makes it more common, and you potentially get that really lovely feedback loop, making things better and better and better over time. So sure enough, we did see that difference between the Netherlands and our two countries, which suggests there's a lot to be gained, but it also does confirm or it does support this idea that the environment that we live in and the environment we see every day is a big part of shaping these perceptions.
We're in LA, so I have to ask this question. How important is Hollywood and other cultural forces in reinforcing motonormativity? Like I think about, I mean, the famous example of Steve Carell is the loser riding his bicycle, chasing a girl, getting away in the car, and it seems like the person success in movies and TV shows is usually a fancy car. Like how big of a deal is what we do, the main thing that LA does in the
Well,
world?
I mean, I've got to say, in first, I'm very disappointed I wasn't flown over to come and meet you for this. I thought when I got the invites, I was going to, be business class over to LA. But I think there's two really interesting elements to that question. One is you're absolutely right. There's loads of really good examples of the way a person travels in film and TV being used to signal something about that person. So I love that you chose that example because I think it's almost the textbook example. The 40-year-old virgin, opening scene, there he is on a bicycle, and you just know that the writers went, there we go, we just saved ourselves 3 pages of dialogue there. We've established exactly who this guy is, and we've done it in 4 seconds with one shot. Now, that's interesting in itself, and clearly this stuff shapes the cultural mood music and influences us and sends a message about what our societies think is good and bad and so on. This is surely important. But I think the other facet of this is you couldn't get away with doing that unless people recognized the shorthand. You know, if they'd done that in that movie and everyone watching it went, "What's this? This guy's amazing. Look, he's on a bike. I don't understand the plot from this point onwards because he's obviously the hero." Then that wouldn't have worked. And so it's only because we've all agreed that someone on a bike is a massive loser that that works. And so again, there's probably another cyclical element here. People recognize your mode of transport as a signal of status. Therefore, popular culture uses that as a shorthand, but they use it, and by using it, that reinforces the recognition of it as a status. And you probably again get a feedback loop there, I imagine.
Well, maybe we need to, just like in the 80s, it was very common to put product placement in movies. Maybe we need to start having some scripts that the guy on foot, the guy taking transit, the guy on bike is the winner somehow in the plot.
Yeah, well, I believe there's a very popular company based not far from you who only allow their products to be used in film and TV when the good guys use it.
Which company is that?
Apple.
Ah, okay. They are not too far from us. So this, to me, this feels like we're living in the Matrix. You know, how do we blue pill everyone, get them to wake up, get them to see the light, get them to recognize how they've had their eyes closed and they've been so biased for so long? Because to me, that's the first step in then getting them to think about maybe a different way of living.
Yeah. I wish I knew what the magic secret was that would just fix this in one step. And I don't think there's a single thing we can do. But I think what we can start to think about is so, you know, as the years pass and I get older and older and closer to the grave, the more you realize there's less and less time to do things. And at the same time, there's more and more people in the world. There's 8 billion people. And I don't have time to go and talk to 8 billion people and persuade them all one by one. So the question becomes, where can you act that maximally influences the most people at once? And I think the kind of social ecological framework that we've thought about gives you a handle on that. So, you know, we're saying here's a person and they're influenced by their social surroundings, and that's influenced by things like the built environment and the legal system, and that's shaped by the cultural environment that you were just talking about. If we've got all of those things all surrounding each other in concentric layers of influence, then that would suggest that the starting point is probably the outside in. Work outside. The more you can change the big things like the cultural picture, the language people use, the more you could change the physical environment. That's probably the better starting point. And I don't know if this is the optimal answer, but one of the places I would love to see action, and I'm partly drawing on the health psychology literature here when I say this, one of the places I'd love to see action is formal messaging from government to recognize that there is a problem with the way we live today. Because, you know, we know from health research and lots of other areas that it's almost an absolutely essential first step, you know, necessary but not sufficient first step. People have got to acknowledge that there is a problem. And I think one of the challenges that holds us back at the moment is too many people do not fundamentally believe there is a problem to be solved.
Yeah, unfortunately, under the current US administration, I think that we're going to double down on the problem before we solve it. But what was Winston
Yeah.
Churchill's famous quote, Americans always do the right thing after they try everything else, or something like that?
Oh, I thought you were about to go for the other one about democracy.
Oh, well, that's a whole other lunchtime chat.
Yeah.
So speaking of governments, one of the toughest audiences to convince and the most influential to convince are the politicians. How do we unbias the people who have the power to change things? And do we talk to them differently? Do we market to them differently? Do we show them different studies, or is it just like anybody else?
I don't know. This is obviously not going to be a complete answer, and obviously I can't tell you in 60 seconds what's going to completely revolutionize government. But something I found myself saying a few times recently, partly as a joke, but one of those jokes that's actually quite serious, is tell me what you care about, and I'll tell you how the answer is less cars. And I think about that quite often in the context of politicians. So, show me a left-wing politician and we can have a conversation about social justice and exclusion from society and helping poorer people and health. And I'll explain to them how the answer is less cars. Or hand me a right-wing politician and we can talk about how people need to be self-reliant and not depend on the state providing them with services, and they should pay their own way and not demand handouts from the government. And I'll explain how the answer is less cars. And no, and again, it's a nice illustration of that, um, you know, motor normativity leading people to act against their values. Even your fairly rabid right-wing politicians, if I believe if they could genuinely see it in objective terms of, the estimates I've seen from this country are that the tax receipts from motoring cover 50-60% of the costs of providing the motoring system. So it is a heavily subsidized activity. I believe there are similar figures in the US, but I can't remember them immediately. It's a subsidized activity. Now, that might be fine. It might be something that we say, yeah, we're happy to subsidize this activity for the good of the country, but we should also recognize that that is true. And politicians, it'd be useful if politicians had an open conversation about whether subsidy for this activity is something they believe is worthwhile.
What advice do you have for parents to help them raise kids that don't think this way? Like maybe it's easier to start off fresh than try to convince adults of something.
Wow. Well, that'd be nice if we could raise a child in a vacuum or something like that and start with a clean slate. Um, I did in an earlier paper, in the first motor normativity paper, we did cite some research, and there's a few bits of work on this from other people, uh, really showing that children learn to drive from the back seat. So when you see a kid in the back of a car, they are internalizing the norms. And there's actually quite a strong correlation between the way you drive and the way your parents drove. Because of course you just sat there learning. That's what kids do. They learn from their parents. They observe their parents and learn what's normal and what's right from seeing what their parents do. And so if you're sat in the front of a car screaming and shouting and speeding and using your phone, they're internalizing that. If you get into your car for every single journey, even when it's just round the block, they're internalizing that. So that's really, that's not an answer. That's a restatement of the problem that children are learning from adults. How we break that? Again, I wish I knew a magic answer that could fix this in one swoop. Changing the environment is probably part of it, but we know people are resistant to having environments changed. But there are opportunities we can think about, new developments, new communities, new streets, things like the New York congestion charging. There are things we can probably jump on where breakpoints are being introduced into people's lives. And that might be one avenue where we could look. We know that natural breakpoints in people's lives are a very powerful opportunity for people to change their behavior. So we could be looking at those at larger scales and see if there are opportunities there. But it's not going to be easy because at the end of the day, with the exception of a handful of people who get adopted, the people who have children raise the children, and there will be a tendency for patterns to perpetuate themselves.
Yeah, I saw on social media today this thing of this mom who drove her son to a Chick-fil-A in an SUV, very American video, but the challenge was to there's a whole movement about freedom of movement for kids and how if we just drive kids everywhere, they don't learn about the world. And she pulled up in front of a Chick-fil-A and had her 7-year-old go in, pick up dinner, come back out and get in the car. And she filmed a video while he was doing that of how nervous she was. She couldn't see if he was in trouble, etc. And most people online were very complimentary. Like, that's great the mom did that. And I think it's great that she did that. But also, I could not help but think this is a drive-through restaurant, probably in a suburb that's super unsafe to walk or bike. The kid's now in the back seat of the SUV, ready to go home with dinner. I mean, without like, I couldn't pay attention to how we're programming the 7-year-old. If this is the way you go get food in America, and the lack of freedom that he had. There's that great TV show on Netflix in Japan where 2 and 3-year-olds walk to do errands, and obviously different
Oh
culture,
yeah, yeah.
but I couldn't unsee the SUV, and I think I was probably the only one pointing that out about the video, but it's very deep, I think, even with parents. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead, please.
but I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, very slightly tangential to your question, but on the one hand, drive-throughs are a really good example of how the built environments, choices we make in our city planning can really, really have an effect on the way people act and what is normal and what is possible. So drive-through is actually quite a good thought experiment. The other thing I thought of, you've just reminded me of some wonderful work by my old colleague Birgitte's Gattersleben, who's a Dutch researcher who works at University of Surrey. And they did this really neat work where they showed people the exact same street scenes. So they had a bunch of videos of street scenes, but you either saw them from the perspective of a driver, a bus passenger, or a pedestrian, but you were seeing the same thing. And what they found was there was this really systematic, clear effect that the more insulated you were by your vehicle, the more frightening the street felt. And so the person on foot, the street felt pretty comfortable, but seeing exactly the same activity from within a car felt frightening. Now, again, to go back to what seems to be emerging as a theme today, there's a self-perpetuating cycle for you. Get in your car, the street feels less safe. So what do? You stay in your car, which makes the street feel less safe. So again, that it's not an answer, but it certainly points at an answer to some extent.
Yeah, I had this argument with an old high school friend. She was taking her kids somewhere. It was in context. I don't know, it was a couple of years ago, but I said, I just discovered this great electric cargo bike, and my kids love it and whatever. And she said, "Oh, my husband would never let us do that. It's too dangerous." I said, "Oh, but there's also smaller cars." And no, we could never have a smaller car because every other car is an SUV. So we need to have a large car. And it made me very sad. And I was like, she's not wrong. Like, it's an arms race that
Yeah.
we're trying to survive in. Um, One other anecdote. I took my I went somewhere as a family the other day, and my kids had the option to either bike with me or drive with my wife. And my middle daughter said to me, "I want to go on the bike so I can see the world," is the way she said it. And I thought it was so beautiful. But the implied thing of that is then kids in cars don't really see the world. And I
Mm.
wonder if that is a way to convince parents that sometimes it might be better to change that.
Oh, do you know, it's funny you say that. I don't know if you have based that question on some work we did. So there's a little body of work going back a few years now, which looked at kids' mental representations of the world based on how they travel. And they did really cute things like just giving kids a load of paper and just say, look, draw where you live, draw where your school is, draw your town. Um, and there's been at least a couple of studies I can think of where the kids who were driven everywhere had incredibly sparse mental maps of space, and the kids who walked had these really rich understandings of the environment they lived in. Uh, so a couple of years ago, we thought, right, well, let's go the full way with this. So we got this data set from like 12,000 British kids, which was this wonderful longitudinal data set. So we had data going from birth up until the age 20. And we used that to essentially track these kids through their lives. And we knew how they were taken to school at various, like at age 4, 7, 11, and 16 or something like that, or 14. And we also knew what their exam scores were at school. So we thought, right, well, wouldn't this be amazing if we could show that this kind of mental mapping, this richness of experience from active travel makes you do better at school? Because I thought, if anything is going to get your typical middle class parent to walk their kid to school, it's going to be that the kid's going to get better qualifications. And I was so disappointed that it wasn't there. It didn't stand up in the analysis. There were some small differences, but nothing that really stood out. The kids who were walking to school at 7, 11, 14, it wasn't notably different to the kids who were being driven to school, except interestingly, in the most wealthy kids. Because obviously we had it broken down by the household income. And in the most wealthy fifth of kids, the most wealthy 20% of families, there was apparently a detrimental effect of being driven to school. So I'm still hoping people will jump on that one because obviously everyone likes to think they're in the wealthiest quintile. So if we work on people's aspirations and they all and sort of look, if you want to be in the wealthier end of society, your kids might suffer if you drive them to school. And I'm hoping people will pick that one up.
That's fascinating. I started one of the first, or maybe it is the first, I don't know, bike buses in LA.
Mm,
And my kid's school is a little bit different. It's called a magnet school. And so it's not a neighborhood school, meaning people might come from all over the city. But we met up at a park. And then for 4 or 5 glorious blocks, these kids got to chat and move and just exercise a bit before school. And I don't have a stat saying, those kids will perform 18% better than the kids that were driven in the SUV. But
yeah.
in terms of being able just to pay attention in a classroom, little kids need to move. They're not meant to just sit.
Yeah.
And I know there's a benefit. I just can't quantify the benefit.
And that's the thing. That's kind of what we were hoping. Because again, I'd seen research saying that kids who have actively traveled to school are more attentive. So we kind of, there is evidence on that. It's just by the time you've gone through this whole chain of things, all the way up to doing qualifications at age 16, it doesn't produce a measurable difference. And we measured it in thousands of kids. So if there was a difference, we'd have found it. There's just so many variables that to my annoyance, that one on its own isn't a big enough effect. That extra attention early on isn't really changing their outcomes.
Maybe we need to do a study that how much percentage would GDP increase if a majority of employees in a country were cycling to work? How much happier would they be, more productive?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Well, I mean, that raises really interesting questions, actually. And I'm not the best person to answer this because goodness knows, I'm no economist. But what's not in the calculations of GDP? And actually, there was a paper published just a couple of days ago on what is not included in active travel cost benefit analyses. Uh, and what all those things, some of these more intangible benefits like community connection and things like this, you get all of these intangible things don't make it into GDP measures as well. Selling a gallon of oil definitely gets into GDP measures. Uh, the value of community connection or knowing your neighbors or easy access to safety, these things aren't measured.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I want to talk about electric cars. My former career, I was in the startup and tech space. And when I tell people in that world what I'm working on at Streets for All, I often get an eye roll, followed by them telling me I'm kind of wasting my time because autonomous electric vehicles are just going to solve it all. Why are electric cars and autonomous electric cars not the solution for all the transportation woes in cities?
So about 9 years ago, my PhD student and I had this conversation, and we were sat in my office. Gus Berzahans, who's a German guy who still works in Britain, and we sort of talked about a couple of these ideas. And I said, I think we should write a newspaper article. And I said, I'll tell you what, Gus, leave me alone. I'll just do a couple of ideas and then we'll edit it together. And I just sat there and literally banged out 1,000-word newspaper article in one go. With no pause, and it was basically finished immediately. And I thought, oh, maybe I've been thinking about this subconsciously for quite a while. And as part of that, one of the things I did at the start, which actually got cut out of the newspaper article, was just to list all the problems with car dependence. Um, and you go, okay, yeah, there's, tailpipe emissions. Great. EVs, they address that. Brilliant. But then that was one of a big list of about 15 things that just came off the top of my head. Collisions, community severance, the Donald Appleyard effects measured in California about the effects of knowing your neighbors and knowing people. social exclusion. What happens to people who can't afford the car? The more you go down the automated or electric vehicle route, the more excluded that person becomes. Congestion is at best untouched by automated vehicles, but probably becomes worse with automated vehicles. There's so many things that it doesn't even begin to touch. So the danger is we become so fixated on tailpipe emissions or carbon, both of which are important, don't get me wrong, but they're not, well, carbon isn't that important for short distance journeys. Carbon's much more a product of your long distance car trips. Tailpipe emissions, yes, are a part of your short distance journeys, and reducing that is great, but there's other ways to reduce that, such as getting off your backside and walking a bit or getting on a bike. So there's such a a manifestation of today's thinking projected forward as a solution to tomorrow. And the thing that came to mind, and actually we linked to it in that newspaper article, was the movie Wall-E, where you've essentially got this huge flotilla of vastly unhealthy people being automatically conveyed from place to place because of, again, physical activity is another massive feature which is designed out of our society by Motability, and which would almost certainly only get worse if that became automated.
Last question, and then I would love to ask you some audience questions. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Bike lanes, street changes, they're often fraught with tension. We spend a lot of time as advocates trying to convince others of what we think is common sense. I had a conversation this morning with I need to be careful here, I'm going to use generic terms, with a politician's office on a major regional project going on in LA, who was telling me that parking spaces were more important than the planned bike lane. So is motornormativity responsible for the tension that comes with rearranging our streets? And do you have any advice specifically for advocates who try to fight this good fight?
Yeah, I think there's something that's come out of a couple of recent bits of research that we've done that I think might directly speak to that. So we've done two pieces of work now, one in the UK about 4 or 5 years ago with a genuinely representative sample of the population, and then the most recent motornormativity work, which was partly in the US, which did something similar. And in both of them, we found this phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, which is something my colleague Adrian Davis put me onto years ago. He loves this phenomenon, and he was convinced that you should see it in the context of transport. So pluralistic ignorance is a fairly well understood phenomenon where some of the time people assume that what they think must be unusual. So they'll often hold a view or hold an opinion, but they'll go, well, looking around, I guess I'm the only one, or I guess this is quite a minority view. So I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to keep this to myself. So we found this with the transport work. So in the recent work, we asked people, we did a really direct measure. We said, on a sliding scale, how much do you support being able to travel by car? And so we had a measure for each person. And then from the same people, we say, okay, and on a sliding scale, how much do you support being able to get around without using a car? And then you simply subtract one from the other and you get a bias. So if they saw car travel and non-car travel as equally important, they'll have a score of 0. If they got a positive score, they prefer non-car travel, and a negative score, they prefer car travel. The majority of people, even in the US, had clear positive scores, which was nice. But what we saw as well, we then asked everybody, okay, so that's what you think. What do you think your friends and family think? What do you think the people who live near you think? And they gave completely different answers. So if I was to characterize the average response, again, even in the US, the average person was saying, yeah, I think being able to travel without a car is more important than being able to travel with a car. What do my neighbors think? Oh no, they think completely the opposite. And it was very, very powerful in the data. And you had something like 70% of people thought that they were above average in their support for non-car travel. So most people thought they were a minority. Now, that's a long story, but it's quite important background because the implication is that the way we have been doing consultation is completely wrong. Look at how we do consultation. Someone in City Hall draws up a plan and they say, okay, we're going to take away those 2 parking spaces and put a bike lane in. And then they'll say, anyone got a view on that? Anybody want to say anything? And 3 angry people go, where am I going to park? Shout, 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 shout. And all the rest go, my God, well, I think I'm the only one who supports traveling with that car. And I'm hearing a lot of shouting and no one else is saying anything. And so I'd strongly suggest that this pluralistic ignorance effect is causing people to believe that their view needs to stay quiet. So the lesson for policymakers, and especially the lesson for advocates, we can't just ask people for opinions randomly. We can't just ask people to shout if they've got an opinion, because a lot of people will be keeping quiet for systematic reasons. When we want to know what people think about proposed changes, we've got to ask systematically. We've got to ask a representative slice of the population and find out what is the true balance of feeling from individuals who are not listening to each other, and not listen to the loud voices, because look what that's doing.
I'll share with you, before Measure HLA, we did polling, and we asked questions like, do you feel safe crossing the street? Do you like the idea of having options, bike lanes, bus lanes, etc.? And about 70% of residents in Los Angeles said those things were important. And then we started giving them oppositional things. Well, what about if it takes away parking near your home, or this and that? And even after opposition, we were in the low 60s. The ballot measure wound up passing with about 66% of support. And in Los Angeles, like many places, politicians seem to have a lot of assumptions about what their constituents think about this stuff. But like, to your point, in plurality, most people like walkable, bikeable places. They like spending time there. They like patronizing businesses, etc.
Yeah. And what I really like about the way you did that is you did it in the full honest way. It would be very easy to kind of stack the deck a bit and go, do you want children to die in the street? And you go, oh, look, 100% of people support banning driving. It'd be easy to do that. But you did the real thing. You said, look, would you support street space reallocation, even if it meant you couldn't park easily, even if it meant you drove slower? And you're still seeing a majority. So that's a great vindication of the idea we've got to ask properly.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to some audience questions. We have about 15 minutes left. If you've asked a question and you prefer to ask it live to Ian, just raise your hand and I'll just call on you. Otherwise, I will go ahead and start asking these questions. I don't see any hands. Okay, Robert, go ahead.
Hi, Ian. It's fantastic to hear a couple of those things in particular. My question is simple, to try and spark some bit more debate. What lessons can we learn from Paris and Anne Hidalgo's recent success in getting people to vote explicitly for no more parking and low traffic neighborhoods?
Oh, thank you. That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's 2 or 3 really obvious lessons from that. One is about the role of the environment. If you can create a physical world and a cultural world where traveling actively, where walking and cycling is easy and normal and safe, I think there are 3 key words: easy, normal, safe. If you build a world where it's easy, normal, and safe, then we know that people will do it. We've seen that in parts of London as well. But the other major lesson is the leadership. It did take someone who, at the very top level, who had the executive authority to make changes to the built environment and to stick with it through the initial complaining and to stick with it. She was completely vindicated, I would suggest. But goodness me, I could imagine a lot of city leaders falling away earlier on in that process. Now, the positive now is local politicians tend to be really good at being the second to do things. They love, if you ever speak to local politicians, as you probably have, one of the first things they'll say is, have they done this over in next town? And when you say yes, they go, oh, well, we'll do it then. And I think that's one of the things that the rest of us can possibly benefit from Paris. They had a strong leader. They got it through. Now the environment has changed. Everyone's voting for more of it, as we saw in the last couple of days. And hopefully that acts as an example and a proof of concept that can help other politicians elsewhere.
I want to take literally 30 seconds and show what is one of my favorite political ads I've ever seen. It's from Anne Hidalgo's campaign when she was running for re-election in 2021. Even if you don't speak French, it tells the story.
À Paris, les voitures individuelles représentent 12% des trajets, mais occupent plus de 50% de l'espace. Elles sont la première cause de pollution de l'air. Nous voulons rééquilibrer l'espace public pour réduire la pollution et rendre Paris aux piétons et aux vélos. Paris en commun propose une ville 100% vélo, remplacer 60 000 places de stationnement par des pistes cyclables et des espaces végétalisés.
So I just thought that was one of the best ads I'd ever seen, and she won re-election based on the ad. And if you get this message, please come to Los Angeles and run for mayor. We desperately need you. Okay, I'm going to start asking the pre-written audience questions again. If you have a question in the queue and you wish to ask it live, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to start. So this question is from Brian. One struggle I have had here in the US advocating for rail transportation and rail electrification in the US is environmental organizations, in quotes, work on clean transportation being very car-brained, over-focused on electric cars and ignoring rail. Are green groups in Europe less car-brained, in your opinion?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for all of Europe, but probably not. Again, there's the proof of concept. Most of Europe has a quite mature rail system, which helps. There are alternatives that exist. I think if you've not got a rail system, I suspect even here, if you've not got a rail system, it'll be very hard to get it built because it's so easy for a politician to just push it down to 50,000, 200,000 separate cars and just make the problem of mobility go away through individualizing it and privatizing it. So that's always an easy option for a politician to do. I wish you luck. I think obviously America was a pioneer of the railroads, and I have read about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad back in the day, and I wish you luck in getting it going again. But it is an uphill battle because every single facet of that has to come from either government or industry. None of it's going to come up front from the passengers. Whereas if you just say, oh, look, guys, here's some relatively cheap roads and you buy the vehicles and you fuel them and you make it happen, it's a lot easier for the politician.
Yeah. Okay, next question from Christoph. Have you identified social tipping points in your research? If yes, what triggers them in the context of bike mobility? Is the infrastructure come first or the bike culture?
Oh, that is a good question. We've not specifically looked at tipping points per se. I think that's actually a really good idea for where we might go next to get down into that slightly more micro detail of what happens. My feeling, based on the kind of environmental ecological approaches we've looked at, the social influences, the cultural influences, the physical influences, my feeling is that the outer stuff, the culture, the laws, the infrastructure probably need to come before the social side, because with the best will in the world, it's unbelievably hard to get a substantial social movement going within an environment that is fundamentally hostile to that movement. You do get examples. So the city I used to live in, which is about 50 miles that way across the sea behind me, Bristol in England, there's quite a strong cycling culture there in spite of the infrastructure. But even then, it's still only 3-4% of people. I don't think you'll ever get a really strong active travel culture within an environment that is fundamentally hostile and dangerous for that activity. And so it really feels like if you're going to pick one of those things, I'd go for the infrastructure shift before the social shift.
Yeah, and always
at the very least, it's like a sine qua non of the change.
And we always have the challenge of people saying, see, the bike lanes are empty. They're not useful. And until we build out a whole network and it really gets going, they appear that way sometimes.
Although, as lots of people pointed out, railroad tracks look empty almost all the time because they're so efficient at moving people.
Great point. From Douglas, what are some methods for persuasion of the general population, especially when you live in a place like LA, where walking and biking feel aggressively unpleasant? It seems like saying, look at Amsterdam over and over again is not persuasive.
I think that there's two things coming immediately to mind. And actually one of them, if you like literally just flew me to LA now, like you failed to do tonight, if you literally got me over there, so what are you going to do? I think the first thing I would genuinely be doing now is using those data that you just talked about, Michael. The fact that you asked literal LA residents, and the majority of them, the plurality of them, said, we want change, we want this. And I would be going in very hard with those hard data to make the case for change. This is what people want. It's now our job to create an environment where they can have what they want. That would be the first one. The second thing, which I think has got a lot of promise, but not really been explored yet, is to slightly reframe the question onto the goals. Nobody's goal, well, very few people's goal is to drive a car. Our goals are to get to work, to see our friends, to get food, go to sports games, whatever it might be. That's what we're doing. It's just that if the only game in town for doing those things is getting in your car, people will get in their car. But getting in the car isn't the goal. And reframing the conversation onto what people are trying to accomplish and finding better ways to accomplish those things would be the other big avenue I'd want to explore.
Yeah, as Wes points out in the chat, I have to say, LA is unique in the sense that I think it is the best example in the world of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And what I mean by that is in the 1920s, we had a public rail system that was the largest in the world. Larger than New York, larger than the UK. It was huge. And the standard way to get around was that. People can Google it and read more about the red cars or watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit if you want the Cliff Notes version. But basically, we dismantled that and said, instead we'll use buses, which maybe would have been fine if we had preserved this right of way they had, but we gave the right of way over to cars.
Yeah.
In my mind, the best and worst example I can think of is on Santa Monica Boulevard through Beverly Hills, which was supposed to be a highway, one of the few that got stopped, probably because of the demographics of where it was supposed to go. Where the red car used to go are now free 2-hour parking garages. And there is nothing more Los Angeles than ripping up our rail and putting in free 2-hour parking for cars. Anyway. Okay, question from Tim. You were based in Wales, whose government has canceled the road building program and installed countrywide 20-mile-per-hour speed limits. What are the benefits so far, and how can we get those Welsh politicians to share the benefits with other politicians globally?
Oh, great question. So we're at the point now. So for those who don't know, which I suspect is a lot of people here, the country of Wales, which is roughly 3 million people, just over a year ago imposed a default, and I've got to choose the word very carefully here, default 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in built-up areas, replacing the previous 30-mile-an-hour default. There was always a provision for certain roads to be exempt, but most urban roads are now 20. And oh my God, the complaining. And oh my God, the social norms associated with the complaining. About 9 months ago, I was at an awards event, like the food industry of Wales doing an awards event. And at least 2 of the people who stood on the stage and for the entire crowd, their opening remark was to complain about the speed limits. And everyone else in the room went, yay! So the norms were huge. People hated it. But what's really interesting is here we are a year on, 100 fewer people killed and injured, seriously injured last year. Insurance premiums have gone down in Wales for drivers, and suddenly everyone's gone really quiet. It's really noticeable that the complaining is filtering away. People are going, actually, my car costs £50 a year less to insure. 100 people fewer dead and seriously injured. And the evidence has really, really made a difference to the debate here, it feels. Obviously, the evaluation is still ongoing. Government are doing it very seriously. But yeah, it's been really informative for showing how the hard evidence can overcome this resistance. And also, if any of you are familiar with the Goodwin curve, the importance of pushing past that initial phase of massive response and reaction and getting through so that the new normal can bed in.
That's fantastic. I mean, I can't even imagine Los Angeles with a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. Just on our residential streets, the default is 25. And the way people actually drive is probably more like 35, even on the quiet streets. And actually, cities in California don't have the legal authority to lower their own speed limits without doing a speed survey. And we have this insane law called the 85th percentile that basically says, let's set the speed limit based on how fast people are speeding.
Yeah. And I mean, that raises we won't have time for this now, but this question of how do you police an issue when the majority of the public break the law? And that's a really interesting conversation for the police one day.
Yeah. I have a very quick last question since we went through the audience questions. I didn't ask this in my prepared ones, and I should have. The most striking example I can think of motonormativity is it is essentially legal to murder somebody by a car in the US, as long as you're not on drugs or drunk, as long as you weren't really speeding and you stop and wait for the police. Is that the most egregious example you can think of motonormativity? To me, it kind of is.
Yeah. I think as an illustration, I'm kind of aware from 3,000 miles away. I do see information on this from time to time and look with horror. As a casual acceptance of the harm and in fact, I think it goes right back to something I said nearly an hour ago, that as a society, we somehow construct road danger just like the weather. There's nothing that can be done to prevent it. It is completely outside of human control. The best thing you can do, if you don't like it, stay indoors, wear a hat, wear a jacket. They're the only options given to us for staying safe, because we fundamentally, as a culture, don't believe that we have any influence over this phenomenon. All we can do is we can channel it there rather than there, or we can put a hat on or stay at home, but that's kind of the only options we're given. And that, for me, yeah, you're absolutely right. That for me is peak motonormativity.
Well, thank you. We're basically out of time. Any final words you'd like to leave our audience with?
Oh, please keep fighting. We can get there. If there's one thing that's going to keep me motivated, it's this discovery that most people actually do want change. They just think they're on their own because they don't hear other people say it. We've got to say it. We've got to normalize it. We've got to build awareness that the majority of people do see problems with the status quo. And the more we can build that awareness, the easier the task will become, but it won't be easy.
Well, Ian, I really want to thank you for your time and staying up late in the evening, your time, to have this conversation with us. Thank you, everybody who joined on your lunch break, or if you're in Ian's part of the world, your after dinner break. And thank you for the fantastic work you're doing. Motonormativity was a revelation when I first discovered it. So it's great to have you on.
Well, thank you so much for the invite. It's a real honor to be asked to do this.
And next time we'll fly you over in business class, I promise.
There you go. I only had to drop a few hints and finally it got through.
Message received. Have a good evening or a good day, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.